In the spring of 2008, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt stood at the edge of a barren hillside in southeastern Turkey, staring at something that should not exist. Beneath his feet lay Göbekli Tepe, a massive temple complex with stone pillars weighing up to 20 tons each, carved with intricate three-dimensional sculptures of animals that hadn't roamed that region in thousands of years. The carbon dating came back, and Schmidt's hands trembled as he read the results. 11,600 years old. To put that in perspective, this place was built 6,000 years before Stonehenge, 7,000 years before the pyramids of Egypt. According to everything we've been taught, the people who built Göbekli Tepe should have been simple hunter-gatherers, barely surviving in the wilderness, with no knowledge of architecture, no concept of organized labor, and certainly no ability to quarry, transport, and precisely arrange megaliths that would challenge our modern engineering capabilities. But here's where it gets even stranger. Göbekli Tepe appeared fully formed, with no evidence of development, no practice runs, no primitive earlier versions. It's as if someone flipped a switch and humanity suddenly knew exactly how to create monumental architecture. And then, after serving its purpose for about 1,000 years, the entire complex was deliberately buried. Not destroyed, not abandoned, but carefully filled in with thousands of tons of soil, as if whoever built it wanted to preserve it for a future generation to discover. Klaus Schmidt died in 2014, but his final interviews reveal a man haunted by a single question: who were these people, and what happened to them? Tonight, I want to take you on a journey that challenges everything you thought you knew about human history. We're going to explore a radical possibility, one that connects ancient texts, modern genetics, underwater archaeology, and global mythology into a single stunning narrative. We're going to ask a question that might sound crazy at first, but by the end of this investigation, you'll understand why so many researchers are taking it seriously. What if Adam and Eve were not mythological figures, but real people from an advanced pre-flood civilization that was wiped from the face of the earth? Stay with me, because the evidence we're about to examine will fundamentally change how you see the story of human origins. Let me start with something that should be impossible. Right now, as you're watching this, there are over 200 separate cultures around the world, many of them completely isolated from each other for thousands of years, that all share eerily similar stories. They all talk about a first couple, a paradise garden that was lost, forbidden knowledge that brought consequences, and a catastrophic flood that reset civilization. The Aboriginal Australians, separated from the rest of humanity for over 50,000 years, tell stories of the first man and woman and a great deluge. The ancient Chinese records speak of Nua and Fuxi, siblings who became the parents of humanity after a devastating flood. The Mayans documented multiple destructions of the world, with a pair of survivors each time. Hindu texts describe Manu and Shatarupa as the progenitors of mankind after the waters receded. Coincidence? Maybe. But when you have this level of consistency across cultures that never contacted each other, cultures separated by vast oceans and thousands of miles, you have to start asking deeper questions. Psychologist Carl Jung called this the collective unconscious. But what if it's something more literal? What if these aren't symbolic archetypes, but fragmented memories of actual events, passed down through so many generations that they've been clothed in the mythology of each culture? Now, let's talk about something that made headlines in genetics labs but somehow never quite penetrated public consciousness. In the 1980s, researchers studying mitochondrial DNA, which is passed exclusively from mother to child, made a startling discovery. When they traced back the genetic lineage of all humans alive today, every single line converged on a single woman who lived somewhere between 150,000 and 200,000 years ago. The scientists called her mitochondrial Eve. But it doesn't stop there. In the 1990s, similar research on Y chromosomal DNA, passed from father to son, revealed that all human males share a common paternal ancestor, dubbed Y chromosomal Adam. Now, before the skeptics jump in, yes, these two individuals didn't necessarily live at the same time, and yes, there were other humans alive when they existed. But here's what's remarkable. Genetics confirms that humanity went through multiple severe population bottlenecks, moments when we were reduced to incredibly small numbers, possibly just a few thousand individuals. Something catastrophic happened to our species, multiple times. And the most recent major bottleneck, it occurred right around the time of massive global climate upheaval, approximately 12,000 to 13,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age. Let me paint you a picture of the world as it existed 12,000 years ago. The planet was emerging from an ice age, but it wasn't a gradual thaw. Evidence from ice cores drilled in Greenland shows that temperatures fluctuated wildly. In some cases, the global climate shifted by 15 degrees Celsius in less than a decade. Massive ice sheets covering North America and Europe were melting, but not slowly. Geological evidence points to sudden, catastrophic releases of meltwater that would have sent walls of water across continents. And here's the kicker. Sea levels were 120 meters lower than they are today. That means 27 million square kilometers of land where humans most likely lived because coastal areas offer the richest resources, is now underwater. Every major coastal settlement from that era, if they existed, would be at the bottom of the ocean. Think about modern civilization. Where do we build our cities? On coastlines and near rivers. Ancient humans weren't stupid. They would have done the same thing. And if an advanced civilization existed before the flood, we'd expect to find evidence of it in exactly the places we can't easily look, beneath hundreds of feet of ocean water. But we're starting to look, and what we're finding is disturbing the comfortable narrative of human history. Off the coast of Japan lies Yonaguni, an underwater structure with right angles, terraces, and what appear to be carved stairs. Mainstream archaeology calls it a natural formation, but Masaki Kimura, a marine geologist who has dived there over 200 times, insists it's man-made and dates to at least 10,000 years ago. Near the coast of India, the ancient city of Dwarka, described in Hindu texts as the kingdom of Krishna, was discovered submerged in the Gulf of Kambat. Carbon dating of artifacts pulled from the site suggests human activity going back 9,500 years. Off the coast of Cuba, sonar imaging has revealed what appear to be massive stone structures at depths of over 2,000 feet. The Cuban government and National Geographic were involved in preliminary investigations, but then funding mysteriously dried up, and the discoveries vanished from public discourse. Are you starting to see the pattern? We keep finding impossible things in impossible places, and somehow the story never quite makes it into the textbooks. Now, before we go deeper, I want to take just a moment to say thank you for being here. I'm absolutely fascinated by these mysteries, and it means the world to me that you're interested in exploring them too. If you're enjoying this investigation so far, it would mean a lot if you'd hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we're going to be diving into more of these hidden chapters of human history. There's so much we've been taught that doesn't quite add up, and I think together we can ask better questions. All right, let's get back to it. The story of Adam and Eve, as told in Genesis, contains some very specific details that most people gloss over. It mentions a garden in Eden, and it describes 4 rivers: the Pishon, the Gihon, the Tigris, and the Euphrates. Now, the Tigris and Euphrates still exist today in modern Iraq, but the Pishon and Gihon have vanished from history. Or have they? In 1996, a researcher named Juris Zarins used satellite imagery to trace ancient, dried-up riverbeds beneath the sands of Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. What he found matched perfectly with the biblical description. Before the end of the last ice age, when the Persian Gulf was a fertile valley rather than a body of water, there was indeed a region where 4 major river systems converged, creating an incredibly lush and resource-rich environment. This wasn't mythology. This was geography. And the timeline? Right around 12,000 to 10,000 years ago, before rising sea levels flooded the entire region. The Sumerians, who lived in this exact area and are credited with creating the first written language, had their own version of this story. They called the paradise land Dilmun, a place where there was no sickness, no death, and no suffering. According to their texts, Dilmun was the home of the immortals, the place where civilization began. And just like Eden, Dilmun was eventually lost. So, here's what we're looking at. multiple independent sources, from genetics to geology to archaeology to ancient texts, all pointing to the same approximate time and place. Somewhere in the Persian Gulf region, around 12,000 years ago, something significant happened. A thriving center of early human civilization existed, and then it was destroyed by rapidly rising waters as the Ice Age ended. But if Adam and Eve were real people from this lost world, that raises an even bigger question. What kind of world did they come from? How advanced was this pre-flood civilization? And what knowledge did they carry with them after everything they knew was washed away? For thousands of years, scholars treated the Garden of Eden as pure allegory, a spiritual metaphor with no basis in physical reality. But what if they were wrong? What if the biblical authors were trying to preserve actual geographical information, encoding the location of a real place that their ancestors remembered? Let's start with the text itself. Genesis chapter 2, verses 10 through 14, provides surprisingly specific details. It tells us that a river flowed out of Eden to water the garden, and from there it divided into 4 headwaters. The first is named Pishon, which wound through the land of Havilah, where there was gold and aromatic resin and onyx stone. The second river is the Gihon, winding through the land of Cush. The third is the Tigris, running along the east side of Ashur, and the fourth is the Euphrates. Now, anyone who's looked at a modern map of the Middle East knows exactly where the Tigris and Euphrates are. They flow through modern-day Iraq, the ancient land of Mesopotamia, converging near Basra before emptying into the Persian Gulf. These aren't mythical rivers. They're real, and they've been there for thousands of years. So why would a purely mythological text include 2 verifiable geographic landmarks alongside 2 that seemingly don't exist? The answer might be that all 4 rivers existed, but 2 of them disappeared when the world changed. Dr. Juris Zarins, an archaeologist and Middle Eastern studies professor, spent years analyzing satellite imagery and geological surveys of the Arabian Peninsula. What he discovered was remarkable. Using remote sensing technology that can detect variations in soil density and moisture, he identified the fossilized courses of 2 major river systems buried beneath the desert sands of Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. One of these ancient rivers would have flowed from the mountains of western Saudi Arabia, cutting through a region rich in gold deposits and precious stones, exactly as Genesis describes Havilah. The other would have drained from the highlands of southwestern Arabia. Both of these river systems were active during the end of the last Ice Age, when the climate of the Arabian Peninsula was dramatically different from the harsh desert we see today. But here's the crucial part. These rivers would have converged with the Tigris and Euphrates in a location that is now underwater, because 12,000 years ago, the Persian Gulf didn't exist as we know it. Sea levels were 120 meters lower. The entire Gulf was a fertile river valley, a massive floodplain fed by 4 major river systems, creating what would have been one of the most abundant and habitable regions on the planet. Think about what that means. The biblical description of Eden as a garden paradise watered by 4 rivers isn't just poetic language. It's an accurate description of a real landscape that existed in a specific time period, before catastrophic flooding transformed the entire region. The United States Geological Survey has confirmed these findings. Core samples taken from beneath the Persian Gulf show layers of freshwater sediment and evidence of terrestrial vegetation dating back to the late Pleistocene era. This wasn't ocean. This was dry land, and people lived there. So we're not talking about a vague symbolic location anymore. We're talking about approximately 80,000 square kilometers of prime real estate that is now beneath 60 meters of seawater. If an advanced civilization existed in this region during the tail end of the Ice Age, every trace of their cities, their temples, their monuments would now be buried under sediment at the bottom of the Persian Gulf. And this brings us to the Sumerians, the mysterious people who appeared in southern Mesopotamia around 5,000 years ago and somehow arrived with fully developed writing, mathematics, astronomy, and complex architectural knowledge. They didn't slowly evolve these technologies, they showed up with them. In Sumerian mythology, there's a place called Dilmun, described in their texts as the land of the living, where there was no sickness, no death, and no aging. The god Enki dwelt there with his wife Ninhursag. It was a paradise garden, a place of pure water and abundant life. Sound familiar? But the Sumerians didn't treat Dilmun as a fantasy land. They described it as a real place, and they even provided trade records showing commerce with Dilmun. Most historians now agree that the historical Dilmun was located on the island of Bahrain and the eastern coast of Arabia. But here's the interesting part. Bahrain was not an island 12,000 years ago. It was a highland region in the middle of that fertile river valley. The Sumerian King Lists, which detail the reigns of kings before and after the Great Flood, state that kingship first descended from heaven to the city of Eridu. And where was Eridu located? At the northern edge of what would have been that ancient river valley, positioned perfectly to overlook the convergence of the four rivers. Archaeological excavations at Eridu, conducted in the 1940s and 1950s, revealed something extraordinary. The site shows continuous occupation going back to at least 5,400 BCE, but the deepest layers have never been fully excavated. The initial excavators reported finding temple structures at the lowest levels that displayed architectural sophistication inconsistent with what they expected from such an early period. And beneath those temples, the excavations stopped. Funding ran out, and the dig was never completed. What's buried in those deeper layers? We don't know, because no one has been allowed to continue the work. The site lies in a politically unstable region, and international archaeological teams have been unable to secure permission to resume excavation. Convenient, isn't it? The Sumerians themselves claimed they didn't invent civilization. They said it was given to them by the Apkallu, 7 wise beings who emerged from the Persian Gulf, from the direction of Dilmun, and taught humanity the arts of civilization. These weren't gods in the Sumerian texts. They were described as sages, teachers, beings who possessed knowledge from before the flood. One of these beings was named Oannes. The Babylonian historian Berossus, writing in the 3rd century BCE but drawing on much older sources, described Oannes as a creature that was part human, part fish, who came from the sea and taught the people of Babylon writing, sciences, and agriculture. Every day, Oannes would emerge from the Persian Gulf and instruct the people. At night, he would return to the sea. Now, mainstream scholars dismiss this as pure mythology. But what if it's a garbled memory of something real? What if Oannes wasn't a fishman, but a survivor from the flooded civilization that once existed in what is now the Persian Gulf? Someone who literally came from the direction of the sunken lands, bringing knowledge that had been preserved from the world that was lost. Let me show you something else that's been hiding in plain sight. In 2003, a team of marine archaeologists was conducting a survey in the Persian Gulf using side-scan sonar. They were looking for shipwrecks, but instead they found something unexpected: geometric patterns on the sea floor, structures that appeared to have right angles and parallel lines. The data was sent to the Kuwait Institute for Scientific Research for analysis, and then something strange happened. The findings were classified, and the research team was told that further investigation would not be funded. Similar stories have emerged from other parts of the Gulf. Oil exploration companies, which conduct extensive seafloor mapping for their drilling operations, have reportedly encountered anomalous structures in multiple locations. But their surveys are proprietary, and the data is not available to independent researchers. We know these companies have found something because there have been leaks from employees, but we're not allowed to see the evidence. Why the secrecy? What is being protected? The same pattern repeats itself in other sunken regions around the world. Off the coast of India, the Gulf of Khumbat, marine archaeologists discovered what appeared to be a massive city sprawling across 9 kilometers of seafloor. They recovered artifacts including construction material, pottery, sections of walls, and fossilized human remains. When the organic materials were carbon dated, the results came back showing ages between 9,000 and 9,500 years old. That's older than the Sumerian civilization, older than the earliest Egyptian dynasties. This would rewrite everything we know about the development of urban civilization. The Indian government announced the find with great fanfare in 2002, but since then, the site has been largely ignored by mainstream archaeology. The few Western scientists who've commented on it have been dismissively skeptical without actually examining the evidence firsthand. And this brings me to a critical point about how we approach ancient history. There's an established narrative, a timeline that we've all been taught, that says civilization began with Sumer around 5,000 years ago, that the pyramids were built with copper tools and wooden ramps, that ancient people were primitive and superstitious. This narrative is comfortable. It's linear. It fits neatly into textbooks. But what happens when evidence emerges that doesn't fit the narrative? In many cases, it's simply ignored, dismissed, or buried in academic journals that no one outside specialist circles ever reads. There's a tremendous institutional resistance to rewriting the story, because rewriting the story means admitting that previous generations of scholars got it wrong, and academic reputations are built on being right. So when we talk about Eden as a real place, we're not just talking about geography, we're talking about a fundamentally different understanding of how advanced human civilization actually is. If the Persian Gulf Valley was indeed a center of sophisticated culture 12,000 years ago, and if that civilization was destroyed by rising sea levels, then everything that came after, the Sumerians, the Egyptians, the Indus Valley culture, might not be the beginning of civilization at all. They might be the recovery, the rebuilding, by people who still carried fragments of knowledge from the world that was lost. And if Adam and Eve were real people from this lost world, then they weren't primitive gardeners living in ignorance. They would have been survivors of a cataclysm, refugees from a sophisticated civilization, carrying whatever knowledge they could preserve into a harsh new world where the waters had swallowed everything they'd known. The biblical text actually hints at this. After the expulsion from Eden, we're immediately told that Cain built a city, not a village, not a camp, but a city. Where did he learn urban planning? Where did he get the knowledge of architecture and social organization necessary to construct and govern a city? The text presents this as if it's normal, as if these skills were just naturally available to the second generation of humanity. But that makes no sense unless these people were working from inherited knowledge, rebuilding what their parents' generation had known before the flood came. Let me give you one more piece of this puzzle. In 1994, researchers analyzing ancient climate data from ice cores and deep ocean sediments identified a period of dramatic environmental change that occurred between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago. This period, called the Younger Dryas, saw temperatures plunge suddenly, glaciers re-advance, and then, just as abruptly, the ice melted in massive pulses. The geological evidence suggests that enormous volumes of meltwater were released in catastrophic bursts, some of them equivalent to the flow of all the rivers on Earth combined, released in a matter of weeks or months. These meltwater pulses would have caused sea levels to rise rapidly, drowning coastal regions and river valleys across the entire planet. The timing is perfect. Right when this catastrophic flooding was occurring, right when the Persian Gulf Valley would have been inundated, we see the sudden appearance of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, 11,600 years ago, a monumental construction project undertaken by people who supposedly had no prior architectural experience, unless they did. Unless the builders of Göbekli Tepe weren't primitive hunter-gatherers at all, but survivors from the flooded valley to the south, people who still remembered how to cut and move massive stones, who still understood geometry and astronomy, who were trying desperately to preserve their knowledge in stone before it was lost forever. The Garden of Eden wasn't a mythical paradise in some alternate dimension. It was a real place, a fertile valley watered by 4 rivers, located in what is now the Persian Gulf. And the people who lived there weren't innocent children playing in a garden. They were members of a sophisticated civilization that was destroyed when the waters rose. Adam and Eve's story isn't about the beginning of humanity. It's about the end of one world and the desperate struggle to preserve something, anything, for the next. Here's something that should make you stop and think. In 1987, a team of geneticists at the University of California, Berkeley, published a paper that sent shockwaves through the scientific community. They had analyzed mitochondrial DNA from women across every continent, every ethnic group, every race on Earth. And when they traced the genetic lineages backward through time, something impossible appeared in their data. Every single human alive today descends from one woman. They called her mitochondrial Eve, and she lived somewhere in Africa between 150,000 and 200,000 years ago. Now, before the creationists start celebrating and the evolutionists start protesting, let me be clear about what this actually means. There were other women alive at the same time as mitochondrial Eve, but through a combination of population dynamics, migration patterns, and sheer chance, only her mitochondrial line survived to the present day. Every other maternal lineage eventually died out. But here's where it gets interesting. In the 1990s, geneticists did the same analysis with Y chromosomal DNA, which passes from father to son, and they found Y chromosomal Adam. All men alive today share a common paternal ancestor. But here's the twist. The most recent calculations suggest that Y chromosomal Adam lived between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago, but the confidence intervals are massive, and some studies place a major paternal bottleneck much more recently. What scientists have discovered is that human populations have gone through multiple severe bottlenecks, moments when our species was reduced to incredibly small breeding populations. The most famous is the Toba catastrophe theory, which proposes that 75,000 years ago, when the Toba supervolcano erupted in Indonesia, it nearly wiped out humanity. Genetic evidence suggests we dropped to perhaps 10,000 individuals, maybe as few as 1,000. But there's evidence of other bottlenecks too. Populations crashing, recovering, crashing again. And one of these bottlenecks occurred right around the end of the Younger Dryas period, 12,000 to 13,000 years ago. The same time frame when the Persian Gulf Valley was being flooded. The same time frame when, according to Genesis, humanity was expelled from Eden and had to start over. What if the Adam and Eve story isn't about the first humans ever, but about the first humans of our current era? What if they were survivors of a population collapse so severe that all of us descend from a very small group of people who lived through whatever catastrophe reset the world? Let me show you something most people never consider. The biblical genealogies are weird, really weird. After Adam and Eve are expelled from Eden, their son Cain murders his brother Abel and is then banished. Cain goes to the land of Nod, east of Eden, and there he finds a wife and builds a city. Wait, hold on. Where did these other people come from? If Adam and Eve were the first and only humans, and they only had 2 sons at this point, who is Cain marrying? Who is he afraid will kill him? Who is he building a city for? Traditional religious interpretation says these must have been other children of Adam and Eve, unnamed daughters, and that early humanity practiced incest out of necessity. But there's another reading that's been proposed by theological scholars for centuries. What if Adam wasn't the first human being, but the first human of a new dispensation? What if there were people already living in the land of Nod, survivors or descendants of previous populations? This idea is called the pre-Adamite hypothesis, and while it's controversial in religious circles, it actually solves a lot of biblical problems. It explains where Cain's wife came from. It explains why Cain was afraid of being killed by others. It explains how he could build a city. And it fits perfectly with the genetic evidence showing that modern humans interbred with other hominin populations, including Neanderthals and Denisovans. But I want to take this further. What if Adam and Eve weren't just the ancestors of one genetic line? What if they were the preservers of something else? Knowledge, technology, cultural memory. Look at what happens immediately after Eden in the Genesis narrative. Cain's descendant, Tubal-Cain, is described as an instructor of every craftsman in bronze and iron. This is astonishing because we're supposedly talking about the 4th or 5th generation after the first humans, and they're already working with metallurgy. Not just copper, which was the first metal humans learned to work with, but bronze, which is an alloy requiring sophisticated knowledge of mining, smelting temperatures, and mixing ratios, and iron, which requires even higher temperatures and more advanced techniques. According to conventional archaeology, the Bronze Age began around 3200 BCE in the Near East. The Iron Age started around 1200 BCE, but Genesis places Tubal-Cain's metalworking much earlier, in the pre-flood period. Most scholars assume this is anachronistic, that later editors inserted advanced technology into the story. But what if it's not anachronistic? What if there was advanced metallurgy before the flood, and it was lost and had to be rediscovered. There's actually evidence for this. In 1936, a German archaeologist named Wilhelm Koenig was cataloguing artifacts in the National Museum of Iraq when he came across a peculiar clay jar. It was about 14 centimeters tall, and inside was a copper cylinder with an iron rod suspended in the center. The jar showed evidence of having contained an acidic substance, possibly vinegar or wine. Koenig recognized what he was looking at. It was a galvanic cell, a battery. Carbon dating placed it at around 2,000 years old, from the Parthian period. But the design was so sophisticated that when modern engineers replicated it, they found it could produce 1.1 to 2 volts of electricity. Now, mainstream archaeologists have dismissed the Baghdad battery as probably being used for electroplating gold, if it was even a battery at all. But think about what this means. 2,000 years ago, someone in Mesopotamia understood electrochemistry well enough to create a functioning electrical device. Where did that knowledge come from? Was it invented from scratch? Or was it a remnant of older knowledge? And the Baghdad battery isn't alone. In 1898, a sponge diver discovered a Roman-era shipwreck off the Greek island of Antikythera. Inside was a corroded bronze device with dozens of interlocking gears. When researchers finally X-rayed and reconstructed it in the 2000s using the latest imaging technology, they discovered it was an astronomical computer capable of predicting the positions of the sun, moon, and planets, tracking the Olympic Games cycle, and even accounting for the irregular orbit of the moon. The Antikythera mechanism dates to around 100 BCE. The next device of comparable complexity doesn't appear in the historical record until the 14th century CE. That's a 1400-year gap. We went backward in technological sophistication. How does that happen, unless knowledge was lost? This is the pattern we keep seeing. Sophisticated technology appearing in the ancient world, then vanishing, then slowly being rediscovered centuries or millennia later. It's not the pattern you'd expect from a linear progression of human advancement. It's the pattern you'd expect from a cyclical history, from civilizations rising, falling, and having to rebuild from fragments. Now let me show you something that genuinely disturbs the comfortable narrative of human origins. In 1928, archaeologists excavating in the Paracas Peninsula of Peru discovered a necropolis containing over 300 elongated skulls. These weren't normal human skulls that had been artificially deformed through head binding, a practice common in many ancient cultures. These skulls were fundamentally different in structure. Normal skull deformation through binding changes the shape but not the volume. These Paracas skulls had cranial volumes 25 to 30% larger than average human skulls. They had different suture patterns. Some had only 2 parietal plates instead of 3. The eye sockets were significantly larger. The bone was thicker and denser. In 2014, samples from these skulls were sent for DNA analysis. The initial results showed mitochondrial DNA with mutations unknown in any human, primate, or animal in the standard database. The researcher who conducted the test, Brian Forster, stated that the closest match was to haplogroups found in the Caucasus region and the Black Sea area, but even those were distant relatives at best. Now, I need to be careful here because this research hasn't been fully peer-reviewed and published in mainstream journals. But the physical skulls exist. They're in museums, and they're not the only ones. Similar elongated skulls have been found in Malta, in Egypt, in the Caucasus region, in multiple locations around the world. Some of them are clearly the result of artificial cranial deformation, but others show structural differences that can't be explained by binding. What were these people? Were they a subspecies of human? A different branch of the human family tree? Or, and this is where we venture into very controversial territory, were they hybrids? I know how that sounds. I know it trips alarms in your head, but bear with me, because ancient texts from multiple cultures describe exactly this scenario. The Book of Enoch, which was excluded from the biblical canon but was found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, describes the Watchers, 200 angels who descended to earth and took human wives. Their offspring were the Nephilim, beings of enormous size and strength who dominated the pre-flood world. Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, which is in the canonical Bible, says this: When human beings began to increase in number on the earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Then the Lord said, "My spirit will not contend with humans forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown." This text is describing something that happened before the flood, interbreeding between two different groups, producing offspring that were exceptional in some way, and then God limiting human lifespan to 120 years, as if it had previously been longer. Now combine this with what we know from modern genetics. We know that Homo sapiens interbred with Neanderthals. Europeans and Asians carry 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA. We know we interbred with Denisovans. Melanesians and Aboriginal Australians carry Denisovan DNA. We've also discovered evidence of at least 2 other unknown hominin species that contributed DNA to modern humans, ghost populations that we've detected only through their genetic signature. What if the Nephilim story is a cultural memory of this interbreeding? Not with angels in the supernatural sense, but with another advanced human or near-human population. What if the sons of God weren't divine beings, but members of an advanced pre-flood civilization, and the daughters of humans were the less technologically developed populations living around them? And what if Adam and Eve were part of this mixing? What if they represented the moment when knowledge from the advanced population was passed to the broader human family? Look at what Genesis says about Adam after he eats from the tree of knowledge. God says, "The man has now become like one of us, knowing good and evil." Like one of us. Not like God singular, but like us, plural. Who is us? The text doesn't explain, but it implies there's a group of divine or semi-divine beings, and Adam has now joined their ranks in terms of knowledge. This is echoed in cultures around the world. The Sumerian texts talk about the Anunnaki, beings who came from the heavens and created humans by mixing their essence with primitive earth creatures. The Hindu Vedas describe the Devas and their interactions with humans. The Greek myths are filled with demigods, offspring of divine and human parents. The Chinese legends speak of the Yellow Emperor and other culture heroes who descended from the sky and taught humanity. These stories are too consistent, too widespread, to be pure fantasy. Something happened in our distant past, something that involved the transfer of knowledge and possibly genetics from one group to another. And the memory of that event has been preserved in mythology because writing didn't exist yet to record it as history. The conventional timeline of human civilization says that we slowly evolved from primitive Stone Age people to more advanced societies over tens of thousands of years. But the archaeological record doesn't show slow evolution. It shows long periods of stasis interrupted by sudden leaps. Göbekli Tepe appears out of nowhere with no precedent. Sumerian civilization appears fully formed with writing, mathematics, and complex social structures already in place. The pyramids of Egypt are the most sophisticated at the beginning of the Old Kingdom, and later dynasties couldn't match the precision of the Great Pyramid. This is not the pattern of invention. This is the pattern of inheritance. People building with knowledge they already possessed, knowledge that gradually degraded over time as the full context was lost. And if Adam and Eve were real people from a pre-flood civilization, then they would have been the carriers of this inheritance. Survivors of a world that drowned, refugees who carried whatever they could remember into the new age. Their children would have been the ones trying to rebuild, working from incomplete information, creating myths to explain technologies they no longer fully understood. The story isn't about the first humans. It's about the first humans who remembered. The first ones who tried to preserve the knowledge of what came before. And we, all of us watching this, are their descendants, still carrying fragments of their memories in our DNA and in our myths, still trying to piece together what was lost when the waters rose and the old world died. Imagine standing in the desert of southeastern Turkey in 1994. You're an American archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt, and you've just arrived at a site that Kurdish shepherds have been telling stories about for generations. They call it Göbekli Tepe, the Belly Hill. Previous surveys in the 1960s dismissed it as nothing more than an old Byzantine cemetery. But Schmidt sees something different in the scattered limestone fragments littering the surface. He starts digging. What he uncovers over the next 2 decades will force textbooks to be rewritten. Massive stone pillars arranged in circles, some standing over 18 feet tall and weighing more than 20 tons. They're decorated with elaborate carvings of animals rendered in 3-dimensional relief: lions, bulls, foxes, gazelles, snakes, scorpions, and birds. The artistry is breathtaking. These aren't crude stick figures scratched by primitives. This is sophisticated representational art created by people who understood perspective, proportion, and symbolic storytelling. The radiocarbon dates come back. 11,600 years old. That makes Göbekli Tepe 6,000 years older than Stonehenge, 7,000 years older than the pyramids. And here's the thing that breaks the entire model of human development. According to everything we've been taught, the people who built this were hunter-gatherers. They hadn't invented agriculture yet. They hadn't domesticated animals. They supposedly lived in small, mobile bands, following game and gathering wild plants. So explain to me how these nomadic hunter-gatherers organized the labor force necessary to quarry, transport, carve, and erect stones weighing up to 45,000 pounds. Explain how they developed the artistic skills to create those intricate carvings. Explain how they possessed the astronomical knowledge evident in the site's alignments. And explain why they would even conceive of such a project in the first place. The standard archaeological response is that Göbekli Tepe must have been a ritual center, a sacred place where scattered bands gathered for ceremonies. And sure, that explains the motivation, but it doesn't explain the capability. You don't go from living in caves to engineering monumental architecture overnight. There's supposed to be a developmental progression: simple shelters, then more complex structures, then eventually massive stone construction after you've had thousands of years to practice. Göbekli Tepe has no progression. It appears fully realized, at peak sophistication, and then it declines. The earliest structures, the ones from 11,600 years ago, are the most complex and precisely built. Later circles, built over the next 1,000 years, show decreasing skill and ambition. And then, around 10,000 years ago, the entire complex was deliberately buried under thousands of tons of soil. Whoever built it didn't abandon it. They carefully filled it in, as if they were preserving it. Klaus Schmidt spent the rest of his life trying to understand what he'd found. In interviews before his death in 2014, he admitted that Göbekli Tepe didn't fit any model of human development. He said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that this site proved civilization didn't develop from agriculture. Rather, the desire to build places like Göbekli Tepe may have driven the development of agriculture because you needed a stable food supply to support the massive labor force required for construction. But even that explanation feels incomplete, because it assumes these people were learning as they built. What if they already knew how? What if the builders of Göbekli Tepe weren't primitive people reaching towards civilization, but refugees from a civilization trying to preserve what they remembered? Let me take you to a different location. Baalbek, in modern Lebanon. There's a Roman temple complex there, the Temple of Jupiter, built around the 1st century CE. It's impressive, with columns 65 feet tall, but the Romans didn't build the foundation. They built on top of a foundation that was already there, a foundation made of stones so large that modern engineers can't figure out how they were moved. The foundation consists of blocks weighing between 300 and 800 tons each, but those aren't even the largest. Nearby, still in the quarry, lies the stone of the pregnant woman, weighing approximately 1,000 tons, and beneath it, discovered in 2014, is an even larger block weighing an estimated 1,650 tons. Let me put that in perspective. The largest stones used in the Great Pyramid weigh about 70 tons. The largest crane in the world today can lift about 20,000 tons, but it's permanently mounted and requires massive infrastructure. Baalbek stones were quarried, transported over rough terrain, and precisely fitted into place with tolerances measured in millimeters. The Romans left extensive records of their construction projects. They documented everything, but regarding the foundation stones at Baalbek, they wrote that they found them already in place, They didn't know who built them. They called the site the Tower of Babel and attributed it to giants from before the flood. Before the flood. That phrase keeps appearing. Ancient historians writing thousands of years ago consistently referenced a time before the flood when great works were accomplished. Now let's talk about Egypt, because this is where the evidence gets really uncomfortable for mainstream archaeology. The Great Pyramid of Giza is attributed to Pharaoh Khufu, dated to around 2560 BCE. And yes, Khufu's name appears in the pyramid in red ochre paint, discovered in chambers that hadn't been opened in millennia. So clearly Khufu was associated with the structure. But here's what troubles researchers who've actually studied the construction. The Great Pyramid is built with approximately 2.3 million stone blocks, each weighing between 2 and 70 tons. The precision of the placement is extraordinary. The base is level to within 2.1 centimeters. The sides are aligned to true north with an error of only 3/60ths of a degree. Internal passages are cut through solid limestone with such precision that a razor blade can't fit between the stones. The king's chamber contains granite blocks weighing up to 80 tons, transported from Aswan, 500 miles away, and lifted 300 feet up into the structure. The granite boxes in the chamber are cut with such accuracy that they're flat to within 0.002 of an inch across their entire surface. This isn't Bronze Age technology. The Egyptians of Khufu's time supposedly had copper tools, wooden rollers, and rope. That's it. No iron, no steel, no wheels for transport, no pulleys. And with these primitive implements, they supposedly achieved precision that we struggle to match with modern equipment. Christopher Dunn, a master craftsman and engineer, has studied the granite boxes in the king's chamber. He spent 40 years working with precision tools and materials. His conclusion? These boxes show evidence of advanced machining, possibly with tubular drills that could cut through granite faster than modern diamond-tipped drills. The grooves left in the stone suggest a feed rate that would require tremendous rotational speed and pressure. He estimates the drill would need to apply over 2,000 pounds of pressure while spinning. Now, you can dismiss Dunn as a fringe theorist. Many mainstream Egyptologists do. But he's not proposing aliens or anti-gravity. He's looking at the physical evidence as an engineer and saying these artifacts show signs of sophisticated machining. His expertise is in manufacturing and precision tooling. Shouldn't we at least consider his technical analysis? And the Great Pyramid isn't alone. All across Egypt, there are artifacts that display similar precision. The Serapeum of Saqqara contains massive granite and basalt boxes weighing up to 100 tons each, cut to tolerances that modern stonemasons find baffling. The unfinished obelisk at Aswan, if it had been completed, would have weighed over 1,000 tons and stood nearly 140 feet tall. But here's the critical question. Why is the Great Pyramid the most precisely built structure in Egypt? If the Egyptians were developing these techniques, you'd expect the pyramids to get better over time. Instead, they peaked with Khufu and declined. Later pyramids are smaller, less precisely built, constructed with rougher stones. It's as if the knowledge of how to build at that level of sophistication was fading. Unless Khufu didn't build the Great Pyramid from scratch, unless he restored or completed a structure that was already there, built by an earlier and more advanced civilization, the hieroglyphs inside could have been added by Khufu's workers during the restoration, marking it as theirs without actually having constructed the whole thing. This pattern repeats across the ancient world. The most sophisticated construction happens first, and then the quality declines. That's backwards from how technology is supposed to develop. Let's go to the other side of the planet. Tiwanaku, in Bolivia, near Lake Titicaca, 13,000 feet above sea level. The main temple complex contains precisely cut stones weighing over 100 tons, fitted together with such accuracy that paper can't slide between them. H-shaped clamps made of copper were used to join stones, but these weren't simple castings. Chemical analysis shows the copper was poured molten into carefully prepared channels cut into adjacent stones, creating joints of extraordinary strength. The Gateway of the Sun, carved from a single block of andesite weighing approximately 10 tons, displays intricate astronomical symbols. Researchers have determined that the site aligns with stellar positions, but not current positions. When you calculate backward, accounting for precession of the equinoxes, Tiwanaku's alignments match the night sky as it appeared around 10,500 BCE. That's 12,000 years ago. But conventional dating places Tiwanaku's construction around 500 CE. So either the builders were aligning their structures to stellar positions from 12,000 years earlier, which seems bizarre, or the site is actually 12,000 years old and was later occupied by cultures who didn't build it. Geologist Robert Schoch examined the weathering patterns on some of Tiwanaku's stones. He found evidence of severe water erosion, the kind produced by prolonged exposure to flowing water. But Tiwanaku is now high desert. When was there enough water in this region to cause that kind of erosion? During the last ice age, when glacial melt created vast lakes and rivers. That would place construction significantly earlier than conventional dates suggest. The same Robert Schoch examined the Sphinx in Egypt and made a controversial determination. The weathering on the Sphinx enclosure is consistent with thousands of years of rainfall, but Egypt has been arid for the past 5,000 years. The last time the region experienced rainfall sufficient to cause that erosion pattern was before 7,000 BCE, possibly before 10,000 BCE. Egyptologists reject this dating because it would mean the Sphinx predates Egyptian civilization by thousands of years. But Schoch isn't an amateur. He's a geologist from Boston University, and his analysis is based on standard geological weathering principles. The Egyptological community rejects his conclusions not because his geology is wrong, but because the implications are unacceptable. Now I want to take you underwater, because some of the most compelling evidence for pre-flood civilization is beneath the waves. Off the coast of Yonaguni, Japan, divers discovered a massive stone structure with flat plains, right angles, and what appear to be carved steps and terraces. Marine geologist Masaaki Kimura has dived the site more than 200 times. He's mapped it extensively. His conclusion: it's man-made, at least partially, and based on the depth and sea level data, it would have been on dry land around 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. Mainstream archaeology says it's a natural formation, that erosion can create geometric patterns. And yes, erosion can do that. But erosion doesn't typically create 90-degree angles, doesn't carve parallel channels at regular intervals, and doesn't leave behind what appear to be post holes and drainage systems. Kimura points to specific features that he argues are unmistakably artificial. The debate continues, but what's notable is how few Western archaeologists have actually visited the site. Most dismissals are based on photographs, not personal investigation. Off the coast of India, in the Gulf of Kambhat, marine surveys discovered geometric structures across 9 kilometers of seafloor. Artifacts recovered include pottery, construction materials, and fossilized remains. Carbon dating of wood fragments yielded dates of 9,500 years ago. If confirmed, this would represent urban development millennia before Sumer. The Indian government announced the discovery in 2002. Teams from the National Institute of Ocean Technology conducted extensive surveys, but the international archaeological community has been largely silent. There's been no major effort to excavate or confirm the findings. Why not? If there's even a possibility of discovering a civilization older than Sumer, wouldn't that be worth investigating? In 2001, sonar imaging off the coast of Cuba detected structures at a depth of over 2,100 feet. The images showed what appeared to be symmetrical stone structures arranged in geometric patterns. Advanced Digital Communications, the company that made the discovery, brought in archaeologists and geologists to analyze the data. Initial reactions suggested the formations were not natural, but funding for further investigation disappeared. National Geographic was involved in early exploration, then quietly withdrew. The Cuban government restricted access to the area, and the story faded from public attention. Why does this keep happening? Why do discoveries that challenge the conventional timeline consistently fail to receive serious investigation? Either these formations are natural and can be easily explained away with proper study, or they're artificial and represent revolutionary finds. Either way, shouldn't science want to know? There's a pattern here that's difficult to ignore. Around the world, we find evidence of sophisticated construction, astronomical knowledge, and technological capability existing far earlier than the established timeline allows. And when this evidence appears, it's either dismissed without thorough examination, or the sites become inaccessible due to political instability, lack of funding, or bureaucratic obstacles. The Piri-Reis map, created in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral, shows the coast of Antarctica with remarkable accuracy. But Antarctica wasn't officially discovered until 1820, and it's been covered by ice for at least 6,000 years. Piri-Reis wrote on the map that he compiled it from older sources, some dating back to the time of Alexander the Great. How did ancient cartographers map Antarctica without ice, unless they had access to maps from a time before it was frozen? The Orontius Phineas map from 1531 also shows Antarctica, again with details of the coastline beneath the ice. The Boitsch map from 1737 shows Antarctica as two separate landmasses with a waterway between them. Modern seismic surveys have confirmed that beneath the ice, Antarctica is indeed two landmasses. How did 18th century cartographers know that? These maps suggest the existence of a maritime civilization capable of global exploration and accurate cartography, existing at a time when Antarctica was navigable. That could only have been before the last ice age ended, before 12,000 years ago. So here's what we're looking at. We have monumental architecture appearing suddenly with no developmental progression. We have precision manufacturing that defies explanation with known ancient tools. We have global distribution of similar construction techniques. We have astronomical alignments to time periods thousands of years before conventional dates. We have underwater structures in locations that were dry land only before the post-glacial flooding. And we have ancient maps showing coastlines that haven't been visible in 10,000 years. Individually, each of these could be dismissed. Maybe Göbekli Tepe was just really impressive for its time. Maybe the precision at Giza is exaggerated. Maybe the underwater structures are natural. Maybe the maps are coincidental. But when you look at all of it together, when you see the same pattern repeating on every continent, it becomes increasingly difficult to maintain that nothing unusual was happening in the deep past. The evidence points to a sophisticated global civilization that existed before the end of the last ice age, before the catastrophic flooding that reshaped the world's coastlines. And if that civilization existed, then the survivors, the ones who made it through the cataclysm, would have been the Adams and Eves of the New World. They would have been the ones carrying knowledge of construction, metallurgy, astronomy, and agriculture into the scattered tribes of survivors. They would have been the culture heroes, the gods and demigods of mythology, the Watchers and Apkallu and Viracochas, who supposedly descended from the heavens or emerged from the sea to teach humanity. They didn't come from the sky. They came from the world that drowned. There's a story that humanity has been telling itself for as long as we've had language. It's told in different ways, with different characters, in different settings, but the core remains hauntingly consistent. The world was destroyed by water. Nearly everyone died. Only a few survived to tell the tale. The Babylonians told it in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Utnapishtim builds a boat, seals it with pitch, brings aboard his family and animals, and survives a flood sent by the gods that lasts 6 days and 7 nights. When the waters recede, his boat comes to rest on a mountain. The Hebrews told it in Genesis. Noah builds an ark, coats it with pitch, brings aboard his family and animals, and survives a flood that lasts 40 days and 40 nights. When the waters recede, the ark comes to rest on Mount Ararat. The similarities aren't coincidental. Most scholars agree the Genesis account was influenced by earlier Mesopotamian flood narratives. But here's the question nobody seems to ask. Where did the Mesopotamians get their story? Because they weren't the first either. The Sumerians, writing 1,000 years before Babylon, described a great flood that destroyed the world. The Hindu Matsya Purana tells of Manu, warned by a fish to build a boat before the deluge. The ancient Greeks spoke of Deucalion's flood, when Zeus destroyed humanity and only 2 survivors remained. Chinese records describe Gunyu and the Great Flood that required generations to control. Native American tribes from the Pacific Northwest to the Great Plains have flood legends. Australian Aboriginal traditions speak of the world being covered by water. Polynesian myths describe oceans rising and swallowing the land. In 1951, a researcher named Richard Andre catalogued flood myths from around the world. He found over 250 distinct traditions spanning every inhabited continent. Later researchers have identified over 500 variations. These cultures had no contact with each other. They developed independently, separated by oceans, mountains, and thousands of years. Yet they all remembered water destroying the world. Mythology, say the skeptics. Humans live near water. Floods happen. People make up stories. Except the stories don't describe local floods. They describe global catastrophe. Waters covering mountains. The entire world submerged. Everyone drowning except a handful of survivors. That's not the kind of story you create from watching a river overflow. That's the kind of story that comes from collective trauma so severe it gets encoded into cultural DNA. So what really happened 12,000 years ago? Let me tell you about the Younger Dryas. It's a geological period that began approximately 12,800 years ago and ended around 11,600 years ago. The name comes from a flower, Dryas octopetala, found in sediment layers from this period, indicating that cold weather plants suddenly returned after thousands of years of warming climate. The planet had been warming steadily as the Ice Age ended. Then, abruptly, temperatures plummeted. In Greenland, ice core data shows temperatures dropped by 15 degrees Celsius in less than a decade. Some estimates suggest the shift happened in as little as 3 years. The glaciers that had been retreating suddenly advanced again. Parts of Earth returned to Ice Age conditions. For 1,200 years, this cold snap persisted. Then, just as suddenly, it ended. Temperatures shot up, possibly even faster than they'd dropped. The ice melted rapidly, catastrophically. And this is where the story gets interesting. In 2007, a team of researchers led by Richard Firestone published a controversial paper proposing the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. They suggested that a comet or asteroid struck Earth 12,800 years ago, triggering the sudden climate shift. The evidence? A layer of sediment found at over 50 sites across North America, Europe, and Asia, all dating to the beginning of the Younger Dryas, all containing unusual materials. This layer contains high concentrations of platinum, a rare element more common in space rocks than Earth's crust. It contains nanodiamonds, which form under extreme heat and pressure consistent with impact events. It contains magnetic spherules, tiny balls of melted material. It contains carbon spherules indicating massive wildfires. And it contains shocked quartz, a type of crystal structure that only forms under the intense pressure of impacts or nuclear explosions. The hypothesis was immediately attacked. Critics said the evidence was contaminated, the layer wasn't consistent, the dating was unreliable, and for years, it seemed like the impact theory might die. But then more evidence kept emerging. In 2018, researchers found a massive crater beneath the Hiawatha Glacier in Greenland. It's 19 miles wide, and matches the time frame of the Younger Dryas. In 2019, they announced a second crater nearby. The platinum anomaly has now been confirmed at over 100 sites worldwide. Independent research teams have replicated the findings. What's becoming clear is that approximately 12,800 years ago, something hit Earth. Not one object, but likely a fragmented comet that broke apart in the atmosphere and struck multiple locations. The impacts would have been devastating. If pieces hit the ice sheets covering North America, they would have instantly vaporized trillions of gallons of ice, sending massive amounts of water vapor into the atmosphere and triggering unimaginable flooding as meltwater surged across the continent. There's geological evidence for this. The channeled scablands in Washington state show clear signs of catastrophic flooding. J. Harlan Bretz, a geologist in the 1920s, proposed that the scablands were carved by massive floods at the end of the Ice Age. He was ridiculed by his peers for decades. The establishment insisted that geological features formed gradually through erosion, not catastrophically. Bretz was eventually vindicated. The scablands were indeed carved by flooding of almost incomprehensible scale. Recent estimates suggest water flowed through the scablands at a rate of 17 million cubic feet per second. That's more than all the current rivers on Earth combined. Walls of water hundreds of feet high, moving at highway speeds, scouring bedrock, carrying boulders the size of houses, reshaping the landscape in a matter of days. And that was just one region. If the Younger Dryas was triggered by impacts on ice sheets, similar flooding would have occurred across the northern hemisphere. Glacial Lake Agassiz, a massive body of water held back by ice dams in central North America, would have released catastrophically. European ice sheets would have done the same, but the impacts and immediate flooding were only the beginning. The water vapor thrown into the atmosphere would have created global weather chaos. The dust and debris would have blocked sunlight, triggering the temperature drop. The burning of forests across entire continents would have created smoke that lasted for years. And as the climate destabilized, the remaining ice sheets began their terminal collapse. Sea levels at the end of the Ice Age were 120 meters lower than today. An area the size of the continental United States, currently underwater, was dry land. And when the ice melted, it didn't happen slowly. Geological evidence points to multiple catastrophic meltwater pulses. Meltwater pulse 1 ampere occurred around 14,600 years ago, raising sea levels by 13 to 20 meters in less than 500 years. Some estimates suggest even faster rises during shorter periods. Meltwater pulse 1b happened around 11,500 years ago, another massive release. Meltwater pulse 1c around 8,000 years ago. Imagine what this meant for coastal populations. In a single human lifetime, possibly in just a few years during the worst pulses, the ocean could rise 30 to 60 feet. Coastal plains that had been home to thousands of people would become seafloor. River valleys would become bays. Islands would vanish. Everything built near the coast would be destroyed or submerged. The Black Sea Deluge hypothesis, proposed by William Ryan and Walter Pittman in 1998, suggests that around 7,600 years ago, rising Mediterranean waters breached the Bosphorus Strait and flooded into the Black Sea basin. The Black Sea had been a freshwater lake, sitting about 500 feet lower than the Mediterranean. When the barrier broke, seawater poured in at a rate of 40 cubic miles per day, raising the Black Sea level by over 300 feet. If people lived around that lake, and they would have because it was prime real estate, they would have watched the water advancing day by day, swallowing everything. Those survivors would have carried stories of the deluge to wherever they fled. And it's interesting that the timing of the Black Sea flood coincides with the appearance of new agricultural communities spreading into Europe and the expansion of populations in Mesopotamia. Were these refugees from the flooded basin, people who had lived in a fertile valley that became the Black Sea, now forced to migrate and restart their lives? But even the Black Sea flood was relatively localized compared to the global flooding at the end of the Younger Dryas. 27 million square kilometers of land went underwater. Think about that. Every coastal city, every riverside settlement, every low-lying valley where people would naturally congregate, all of it drowned. If there was a maritime civilization, if there were advanced cultures living along coastlines and major rivers, they would have been utterly destroyed. And the survivors? They would have fled to higher ground, to mountains, to inland regions. They would have lost everything except what they carried and what they remembered. Their cities, their libraries if they had them, their monuments and temples and centers of learning, all gone beneath the waves. This is the fall, not a metaphorical spiritual descent, but a literal destruction of the world as it existed. The expulsion from Eden wasn't God casting out sinners, it was the ocean casting out survivors. The angel with the flaming sword preventing return to paradise wasn't a supernatural guardian. It was the simple fact that paradise was now 300 feet underwater. And when these survivors tried to tell their children and grandchildren about the world before, about the cities and the knowledge and the civilization that had been lost, how would they do it? Without writing, the story would become oral tradition. Over generations, it would acquire mythological elements. Real places would become mystical gardens. Real catastrophes would become divine punishment. Real knowledge would become forbidden fruit. But the core memory would persist. Water destroyed the world. We survived. This is why we're here. The 500 flood myths aren't separate inventions. They're fragmented memories of the same events, seen from different locations, passed through different cultural lenses, but all pointing back to the same historical truth. 12,000 years ago, the world was broken, and Adam and Eve, whether literal individuals or symbolic representatives of survivor populations, were the ones who lived through it and had to begin again with whatever scraps of the old world they could preserve. There's a book that didn't make it into your Bible. Most people have never heard of it, but for the first few centuries of Christianity, it was widely read and quoted by early church fathers, the Book of Enoch. It was found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, proving it existed at least 2,000 years ago, and Ethiopian Christianity still considers it scripture. So why was it excluded from the canonical Bible? Maybe because it tells a story that's too disturbing, too specific, too hard to dismiss as metaphor. The Book of Enoch describes 200 angels called the Watchers, who descended to Mount Hermon and made a pact. They looked upon human women and found them beautiful, so they took wives from among them and taught humanity secrets that were never meant to be shared. But these weren't spiritual lessons. The text is explicit about what the Watchers taught. Azazel taught men to make swords, knives, shields, and armor. He taught the art of warfare. Semjaza taught enchantments and root cutting, early pharmacology. Armoros taught the resolving of enchantments. Barakijal taught astrology. Kokabel taught the constellations and astronomy. Tamiel taught astronomy. Asrodel taught the motion of the moon. And there were others, teaching metallurgy, cosmetics, the use of antimony for eyes, the use of precious stones, the dyeing of fabrics. This isn't vague mystical wisdom. These are specific technologies. And according to Enoch, teaching these things to unprepared humanity was a catastrophic mistake. The text says that when humans gained this knowledge prematurely, violence and corruption spread across the earth. The offspring of the Watchers and human women, the Nephilim, became tyrants and oppressors. And God decided the only solution was to wipe the slate clean with a flood. Now, mainstream theology interprets the Watchers as fallen angels in a spiritual sense. But what if we read this text anthropologically, as a cultural memory encoded in religious language? What if the Watchers weren't supernatural beings but members of an advanced pre-flood civilization? What if they were the Adams and Eves, the survivors and descendants of a technological society, and the humans they taught were the less developed populations living around them? Think about it. After a civilization-destroying catastrophe, you'd have survivors with advanced knowledge interacting with populations who'd remained at a more primitive level. The survivors would seem almost godlike to the others. They'd have knowledge of working metal when others only had stone. They'd understand the stars when others only saw lights in the sky. They'd have writing when others only had oral tradition. And if these advanced survivors shared their knowledge, if they took spouses from the local populations and had children who inherited both the genes and the teaching of their parents, you'd create exactly what the ancient texts describe: a hybrid generation, more capable than either parent population alone, but also more dangerous because they possessed power without the cultural safeguards that had developed alongside it in the original civilization. The text says the Nephilim were giants, mighty men, men of renown. And here's where it gets archaeological. There are persistent reports of giant skeletons being discovered and then vanishing into institutional collections. The Smithsonian has been repeatedly accused of suppressing evidence of unusually large human remains. In 1897, the New York Times reported on a mound excavation in Tennessee where skeletons of enormous stature were found. In 1902, they reported on discoveries in California. In 1912, skeletons 7 to 8 feet tall were supposedly found in Wisconsin. Throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s, newspapers across America documented similar finds. Now, were these reports accurate, or were they sensationalized journalism? Hard to say, because the physical evidence has disappeared. The Smithsonian's official position is that no such skeletons exist in their collection, and that giant skeleton stories are hoaxes or misidentifications. But researchers filing Freedom of Information requests have hit bureaucratic walls. Documents are classified, access is denied, or records claim no documentation exists. What we do have are the Paracas skulls I mentioned earlier, which show morphological differences that can't be easily explained. We have ancient artwork from cultures worldwide, depicting beings of unusual size interacting with normal humans. We have mythological accounts from every inhabited continent describing giants who existed before the flood. The Bible itself references the Nephilim not just before the flood, but after it. Numbers chapter 13 describes the Israelite spies returning from Canaan and reporting, "We saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." The giants of Canaan. Goliath, killed by David, was described as over 9 feet tall. King Og of Bashan supposedly had a bed that was 13 feet long. The Rephaim, the Emim, the Anakim, all tribes described in ancient texts as being of unusual height and strength. Either these are all fantasy, or humanity once had populations that were significantly larger than average. And if the latter, where did they come from? Genetic anomalies? Isolated populations with different evolutionary pressures? Or hybrid offspring from a pre-flood population that had different physical characteristics? Let's connect this to Sumeria, because the parallels are impossible to ignore. In Sumerian texts, the Apkallu are described as 7 sages who emerged from the sea in the time before the flood. They taught humanity the arts of civilization, writing, mathematics, agriculture, architecture, law, exactly what the Watchers taught in Enoch. The Apkallu are consistently depicted in Sumerian art as beings who look part human, part fish. Not because they were literally fish people, but possibly because they came from across the water, from the direction of the flooded Persian Gulf basin. Survivors from the drowned lands, appearing to the primitive populations of inland Mesopotamia, bringing knowledge from the lost world. Berossus, the Babylonian priest and historian writing around 270 BCE, preserved these stories. He described Oannes, the first of the Apkallu, as rising from the sea each day to teach humanity, then returning to the water at night. Berossus was drawing on temple records that were already ancient in his time. These weren't new myths. They were historical accounts passed down for thousands of years. And here's the critical detail. Berossus explicitly states that before the Apkallu arrived, humans lived like animals, without culture, without knowledge. After the Apkallu taught them, civilization began. This isn't gradual evolution. This is sudden transfer of knowledge from an outside source. The same pattern appears in Egypt. The god Thoth, who taught humanity writing and science. In Greece, Prometheus, who stole fire from the gods and gave it to humans. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl and Viracocha, culture bringers who appeared from across the sea, taught civilization, and then departed with promises to return. In India, the Nagas, serpent beings who possessed great wisdom. In China, the Yellow Emperor, who descended from the heavens and taught agriculture and medicine. Every major ancient civilization has myths of culture bringers, teachers who came from elsewhere and elevated humanity from savagery. And these teachers are consistently described as different from normal humans, taller, wiser, longer lived, possessing knowledge that seemed magical. The tree of knowledge in Genesis isn't just a symbolic fruit tree. It's a metaphor for the transfer of advanced information. Adam and Eve didn't literally eat a piece of fruit and suddenly understand good and evil. They gained knowledge that changed their status. The text says their eyes were opened. They realized they were naked. They felt shame. These aren't botanical effects. These are psychological effects of sudden awareness, of consciousness expanding, of understanding things they hadn't understood before. And God's response? The man has now become like one of us, knowing good and evil, like one of us. There's that plural again. Who is us? The text never explains, but it implies a group of knowledgeable beings, and Adam has now joined their ranks through the acquisition of forbidden information. What if the forbidden knowledge was technology? What if it was metallurgy, agriculture, astronomy, mathematics, all the things the Watchers and Apkallu supposedly taught? These technologies are neutral, but in the wrong hands or introduced prematurely, they become dangerous. A society that develops agriculture gradually adapts its social structures. A society given agriculture suddenly faces population, explosion, and resource competition. A society that gradually develops metallurgy learns to regulate weapon production. A society given metallurgy suddenly faces an arms race. The Watchers weren't punished for teaching humanity spiritual truths. They were punished for sharing technologies that humanity wasn't ready to handle responsibly. And the result, according to Enoch, was violence, corruption, and eventually the necessity of the flood to reset everything. This interpretation makes the Adam and Eve story remarkably coherent. They weren't the first humans. They were the first humans to receive advanced knowledge. The serpent who tempted Eve wasn't a talking snake. It was one of the Watchers, described as a serpent because the ancient word used, Nahash, means both serpent and shining one. The Watchers were the shining ones, the enlightened ones, the ones with knowledge. When Eve ate from the tree and gave some to Adam, they were accepting the offer of education from these advanced beings. And yes, it elevated them. Yes, it gave them capabilities they didn't have before. But it also came with consequences. They lost their innocence, their simple existence. They became aware of their vulnerability. They were expelled from Eden not as punishment, but as the natural result of the world changing around them. Because here's the thing about advanced knowledge. You can't unknow it. Once humans learned metallurgy, there was no going back to stone tools. Once they learned agriculture, there was no returning to pure hunting and gathering. Once they learned writing, oral tradition would never be the same. The knowledge spread, transformed societies, created new power structures, and ultimately contributed to the conflicts and chaos that characterized the pre-flood world. And when the flood came, when the comet impacts and the meltwater pulses destroyed that civilization, the knowledge didn't entirely disappear. Some of it survived in the minds of people like Adam and Eve, like Noah, like the Apkallu, like whatever other survivors managed to live through the catastrophe. They carried it forward, taught it to their children, and those children tried to rebuild. But here's the tragic part. They couldn't rebuild fully. Too much was lost. The complete technological base was gone. The infrastructure, the supply chains, the institutional knowledge, all destroyed. What remained were fragments, pieces of the puzzle that no longer fit together properly without the full context. So the survivors taught what they could, preserved what they remembered, and watched as their descendants struggled to apply incomplete knowledge in a world that had been broken. And over time, as generations passed, the teachers themselves became mythologized. The real people who'd survived the flood and carried knowledge from the old world became gods, angels, culture heroes, depending on which culture was telling the story. The Watchers weren't angels who fell from heaven. They were humans who fell from civilization into catastrophe and did their best to rebuild from the ashes. And we, thousands of years later, are still trying to piece together what they knew and what was lost when the waters rose. Adam lived 930 years. His son Seth made it to 912. Seth's son Enosh reached 905. Then came Kenan at 910, Mahalalel at 895, and Jared at 962. Enoch only lived 365 years before God took him, but his son Methuselah holds the record at 969 years. Methuselah's son Lamech lived 777 years, and then came Noah at 950. These numbers sound absurd. Nobody lives that long. It's obviously mythology, right? Symbolic ages, not literal years. Except that ancient cultures took these genealogies very seriously. They were meticulous record keepers. The Sumerian King List, which predates the biblical text, also records impossibly long reigns for pre-flood kings, some ruling for tens of thousands of years, which is clearly exaggerated, but the pattern is consistent. Before the flood, lifespans were dramatically longer than after. After Noah, something changes. His son Shem lives 600 years, still long but declining. Abraham makes it to 175. Isaac reaches 180. Jacob lives 147. Moses dies at 120. By the time of King David, lifespans have dropped to something approaching modern norms, 70 to 80 years. What happened? Why does the Bible record this steady decline in human longevity? And more importantly, is there any scientific basis for thinking humans could have once lived significantly longer than we do now? Let's start with the environment. Genesis chapter 1 describes creation with a detail that most people skip over. Verse 7 says God made the vault and separated the water under the vault from the water above it. Water above the vault. What does that mean? Some creation scientists have proposed the vapor canopy theory. Before the flood, Earth's atmosphere contained a layer of water vapor, or possibly ice crystals suspended in the upper atmosphere, creating a greenhouse effect that provided more uniform temperatures globally and filtered out harmful radiation from the sunday. This canopy would eventually collapse during the flood, providing some of the water for the deluge, but more importantly, removing Earth's protective shield. Without that canopy, humans would suddenly be exposed to much higher levels of cosmic radiation and ultraviolet light. DNA damage would accumulate faster, cancer rates would increase, aging would accelerate, and lifespans would plummet. Now, mainstream science doesn't accept the vapor canopy model because the physics are problematic. That much water vapor in the atmosphere would create immense heat and pressure. But what if it wasn't water vapor? What if Earth's magnetic field was significantly stronger in the past, providing better protection from solar radiation? We know Earth's magnetic field is weakening. It's decreased by about 10% over the last 170 years. If you extrapolate backward, the field would have been substantially stronger 10,000 years ago, potentially providing a protective effect similar to what the vapor canopy theory proposes. NASA studies have shown that astronauts on the International Space Station exposed to higher radiation levels due to being outside Earth's full magnetic protection age faster at the cellular level. Their telomeres, the protective caps on the ends of chromosomes that shorten with each cell division, degrade more quickly. If pre-flood humans lived under a stronger magnetic field with better radiation shielding, their cellular aging process could have been significantly slower. But there's another piece to this puzzle. Ancient air trapped in amber, fossilized tree resin from millions of years ago contains atmospheric samples that scientists can analyze. Studies of these air bubbles have revealed oxygen concentrations significantly higher than our current 21%. Some samples show oxygen levels of 30 to 35%. Higher oxygen concentration has profound effects on biology. In the Carboniferous period, 300 million years ago, when oxygen levels were around 35%, insects grew to enormous sizes. Dragonflies had wingspans of over 2 feet. Millipedes grew to 8 feet long. Scorpions reached 2.5 feet. These creatures could only exist in a high oxygen environment because their respiratory systems rely on passive diffusion. Vertebrates, including humans, would benefit even more from elevated oxygen. Cellular metabolism would be more efficient. Tissue repair would accelerate. Athletic performance would increase dramatically. And aging, which is partly caused by oxidative stress and cellular damage from inefficient oxygen processing, might slow considerably. Modern hyperbaric oxygen therapy, where patients breathe pure oxygen in pressurized chambers, has shown remarkable healing effects. Wounds heal faster. Brain injuries recover better. Some studies suggest it can even extend cellular lifespan by protecting telomeres. If pre-flood humans lived in an atmosphere with naturally higher oxygen content, combined with better radiation protection, their bodies would have functioned more efficiently and aged more slowly. There's also the question of atmospheric pressure. Computer models of pre-flood Earth, assuming the vapor canopy or different atmospheric composition, suggest surface pressure could have been significantly higher. High-pressure environments allow for more efficient gas exchange in the lungs and throughout the body. Deep-sea divers and people living in hyperbaric conditions show enhanced physical performance. Could pre-flood humans have experienced this naturally? Now let's talk about telomeres more directly. Every time a cell divides, its telomeres shorten slightly. After about 50 to 70 divisions, the telomeres become too short, and the cell enters senescence or dies. This is called the Hayflick limit, and it's essentially the cellular basis for aging. But some organisms don't follow this rule. Lobsters produce an enzyme called telomerase that rebuilds their telomeres after each cell division. They don't experience cellular aging the way we do. They can theoretically live indefinitely, only dying from disease, predation, or eventually becoming too large to molt successfully. Certain species of jellyfish can reverse their aging process entirely. The Greenland shark lives over 400 years. The bristlecone pine tree can survive over 5,000 years. So, biological immortality, or at least extreme longevity, isn't fantasy. It exists in nature. The question is, did humans once possess mechanisms for dramatically slowed aging that we've since lost? Here's where genetics gets interesting. 98% of human DNA is classified as non-coding, sometimes called junk DNA. For decades, scientists assumed this DNA served no function, that it was evolutionary leftover, accumulated mutations with no purpose. But recent research has shown that much of this non-coding DNA is actually regulatory, controlling when and how genes are expressed. What if some of this DNA contains dormant information, genes that were once active but have been switched off? What if pre-flood humans had active longevity genes that became suppressed after the environmental changes caused by the catastrophe? There's a biblical clue to this. In Genesis chapter 6, verse 3, right before the flood narrative, God says, "My spirit will not contend with humans forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years. This isn't describing the flood itself. It's describing a decision to limit human lifespan. And interestingly, 120 years is close to the maximum verified human lifespan today. Jean Calment lived to 122. A handful of others have reached 118 to 120. Is that our built-in limit now? And was there once no such limit, or at least a much higher one? Consider another angle. Diet. Pre-flood Earth, if it was indeed warmer and more humid globally, would have been far more fertile. The Persian Gulf Valley before it flooded would have been an agricultural paradise with year-round growing seasons and incredible biodiversity. The quality and variety of nutrition available would have been superior to what most humans have access to even today. We know that caloric restriction and optimal nutrition can extend lifespan in laboratory animals. Rats on restricted diets live 30 to 40% longer than rats allowed to eat freely. Studies of human populations with nutrient-dense, low-calorie diets show remarkable health outcomes and longevity. If pre-flood humans had access to ideal nutrition without the processed foods, pollutants, and environmental toxins of modern life, their bodies would have functioned at peak efficiency. And then the flood changed everything. The climate became harsher, more variable. The greenhouse warmth gave way to ice ages and deserts. The fertile valleys were underwater. The optimal growing regions were gone. Humans had to adapt to eating whatever they could find, often in environments hostile to agriculture. The quality of life plummeted, and so did the quality of health. Noah lived 950 years, but he was born before the flood. His son Shem lived 600 years, experiencing both pre-flood and post-flood conditions. Shem's descendants show progressive decline, each generation losing a little more of the longevity their ancestors possessed. It's as if the genetic and environmental advantages were fading with each passing generation, diluted by new conditions that human biology hadn't adapted to. There's one more disturbing possibility. What if the Watchers, the Nephilim, the advanced pre-flood population, actually had biological advantages that we lack? What if their genetics included active longevity mechanisms, and when they interbred with regular humans, some of their descendants inherited these traits? The biblical patriarchs who lived for centuries might have been closer genetically to that pre-flood population, as those genes were diluted over generations through intermarriage with populations that didn't carry the longevity traits. Lifespans normalized to what we see today. We might be the descendants of those unions, but thousands of years removed, having lost most of the beneficial genetics in the process. Modern scientists are actively working on life extension. They're studying telomerase activation, genetic modifications to slow aging, cellular reprogramming to reverse senescence. Companies are spending billions trying to crack the aging code. But what if we're not discovering something new? What if we're rediscovering something we lost? What if the secret to extended human lifespan isn't in the future but in the past, encoded in dormant genes we no longer know how to activate? The biblical record of declining lifespans after the flood might not be mythology. It might be the historical documentation of humanity losing something precious, some biological advantage that existed before the world changed. And if Adam and Eve were real people from a pre-flood civilization living in optimal conditions with superior genetics, 930 years doesn't sound quite so impossible anymore. It sounds like something worth trying to understand. Walk into any bookstore in Tokyo, Ask for their creation myths, and you'll hear about Izanagi and Izanami, the first man and woman who stirred the ocean with a jeweled spear and created the islands of Japan. Fly to New Zealand, sit with Maori elders, and they'll tell you about Tiki, the first man formed from red clay. Drive through the Australian outback, and Aboriginal communities will share stories of the Dreamtime, when the first ancestors emerged and shaped the world. Take a boat up the Amazon, and indigenous tribes will describe how the first people were created and placed in a garden before something went wrong. These cultures never met. They developed independently for tens of thousands of years, yet they're all telling the same story. In ancient Sumer, long before the Hebrews wrote Genesis, there was Adapa. The name itself is linguistically similar to Adam. Adapa was created by the god Enki as a model of humanity, perfect in wisdom. He was offered the bread and water of life, which would have made him immortal, but he refused. Having been told it was the bread and water of death, he lost his chance at eternal life through deception. Sound familiar? The Sumerians also told of Titi, whose name shares roots with the Assyrian word for clay or life. Some scholars have suggested Titi was Adapa's female counterpart, though the texts are fragmentary. Together, Adapa and Titi represent the prototype humans who possessed great wisdom but lost immortality. Now travel west to ancient Greece. Prometheus, whose name means forethought, created humans from clay and water. He loved his creations so much that he stole fire from the gods to give them knowledge and technology. Zeus, furious at this transgression, punished Prometheus and created Pandora, the first woman. She was given a jar, often mistranslated as a box, and told never to open it. But curiosity overcame her. She opened it, and all the evils of the world escaped. Disease, death, suffering, toil. Only hope remained inside. The parallels to Eden are striking. A first man, a first woman created after him, divine knowledge that wasn't supposed to be shared, transgression and punishment, the loss of an easier existence, and the introduction of suffering and mortality. Different characters, different setting, same narrative structure. Move east to India. The Rig Veda, one of humanity's oldest texts, tells of Yama and Yami, the first mortal twins. Yama becomes the first human to die, and thus rules the realm of the dead. Another text describes Manu, the first man, who survives a great flood with the help of a fish deity. After the waters recede, he performs a sacrifice, and from that sacrifice, a woman named Ida is created. Together, they become the progenitors of humanity. First man, first woman, catastrophic flood, repopulation. The details differ, but the framework is identical. In China, Nua and Fuxi are depicted as the creators and ancestors of humanity. Ancient artwork shows them with human upper bodies and serpentine lower bodies, their tails intertwined. Nua is said to have created humans from yellow clay, spending great effort to craft each one individually until she grew tired and simply dragged a rope through the mud, with the droplets becoming people. The carefully crafted ones became nobility. The rope, splatter ones became commoners. After a catastrophic event where the pillars holding up the sky were damaged, Nua repaired the heavens and saved humanity from extinction. What's fascinating is that Chinese tradition explicitly depicts Nua and Fuxi as siblings who became spouses after a great flood destroyed everyone else. They were reluctant, knowing incest was wrong, but saw no alternative to preserve humanity. This honest acknowledgement of a taboo makes the story feel less like sanitized myth and more like an uncomfortable historical memory. Norse mythology gives us Ask and Embla, the first man and woman, created by Odin and his brothers from two trees, an ash and an elm. The gods breathed life and consciousness into them, and they became the ancestors of all humanity. Even in the frozen north, isolated from Middle Eastern and Asian cultures, the Vikings told a story of a first couple specially created by divine beings. Cross the Atlantic. The Aztec codices describe multiple creations and destructions of the world. In the current era, the fifth sun, the first humans were Oxomoco and Sipactonal. They were created as elders, already possessing wisdom, and the ability to divine the future. The gods consulted them on important matters. But this couple lived after 4 previous worlds had been destroyed by jaguars, wind, fire, and flood. The memory of cyclical catastrophe is baked into Mesoamerican cosmology. The Inca spoke of Viracocha, the creator god, fashioning the first people from stone. When these people disappointed him, he destroyed them with a flood, then created a new generation. The survivors of this second humanity spread across the land, and the Inca royal line claimed direct descent from them. In West Africa, the Yoruba people tell of Obatala, who created the first humans from clay. He made many, but got drunk on palm wine, and some came out deformed. When he sobered up and saw what he'd done, he vowed to protect those with disabilities and defects, becoming their patron deity. It's a different moral lesson, but the creation of humans from Earth by a divine being remains the core motif. The Polynesian islands, settled by seafaring peoples who spread across the Pacific, each developed their own variations, but the theme persists. In Hawaii, Kumu Honua, whose name literally means earth beginning, was the first man. Ki'i was sometimes named as the first woman. In Tahiti, Ta'aroa created the first humans and placed them in paradise. In Samoa, Tagaloa made the first people and gave them a garden to tend. Even the Inuit of the Arctic, living in one of Earth's harshest environments, have stories of the first people emerging from the earth, though their myths focus less on a paradise lost and more on the harsh struggle for survival. Yet the concept of an original couple or small group from whom all others descend remains present. What are we supposed to do with this information? We have hundreds of cultures, separated by oceans, mountains, deserts, and ice, who never had contact with each other during their formative periods, all independently arriving at the same basic story. 2 original humans, or a small group, a special place where they lived, something going wrong, loss of innocence or immortality, often a catastrophic flood, the need to start over. Carl Jung proposed the collective unconscious, the idea that certain symbols and narratives are hardwired into human psychology, archetypes that emerge naturally regardless of culture. And maybe that's part of it. Maybe the human brain is predisposed to create certain types of stories. But there's another possibility that deserves serious consideration. What if these aren't independent inventions? What if they're cultural memories of actual events? What if, sometime in the deep past, there really was a catastrophe that reduced humanity to small survivor populations? What if those survivors really did carry knowledge from a lost civilization? What if the story got passed down through oral tradition for so many generations that it fractured into different versions, each culture clothing the core memory in their own symbolic language? The consistency is too striking to dismiss as coincidence. The details vary. The characters have different names. The settings shift. But the skeleton of the story remains remarkably stable. First humans. Paradise or advanced state. Forbidden knowledge or transgression. Fall from grace. Catastrophe. Survival. New beginning. That's not mythology. That's history trying to survive without writing. That's collective memory, doing its best to preserve something true across thousands of years and thousands of miles. And at the center of all these stories, in whatever form they take, are Adam and Eve, the first ones who remembered, the ones who lived through the end of the old world and the beginning of the new, the ancestors whose story became humanity's story, told and retold, until it became the foundation myth of our species. We are their children, and deep in our cultural DNA, we still remember what happened to them, even if we've forgotten it was real. Something changed in archaeology over the last decade. Not the methods, not the tools, but what we're able to see. Light detection and ranging, LiDAR for short, is a laser-based scanning technology that can penetrate jungle canopy and map the ground beneath. It was originally developed for atmospheric research and geological surveys, but when archaeologists started pointing it at regions covered by dense vegetation, the hidden world revealed itself. In 2018, a team working in Guatemala used LiDAR to survey the Petén region. They expected to find some new structures around the known Mayan sites. Instead, they discovered over 60,000 previously unknown buildings, entire cities, road networks, agricultural systems, defensive fortifications, all hidden beneath the rainforest. The population estimates for Mayan civilization had to be revised upward by millions. Places that were thought to be lightly settled wilderness turned out to be sophisticated urban landscapes. This happened in 2018, less than 7 years ago, which raises an uncomfortable question. What else is out there that we simply haven't looked for properly? In 2019, LiDAR surveys in the Amazon basin revealed similar results. Massive earthworks, geometric patterns suggesting urban planning, evidence of large-scale agriculture. The Amazon wasn't pristine wilderness. It was managed, cultivated, inhabited by civilizations we're only now beginning to understand. In 2021, archaeologists used LiDAR in Cambodia around Angkor Wat and discovered that the temple complex was just a small part of a vast urban sprawl, covering over 1,000 square kilometers. The city was far larger and more complex than anyone realized. Here's the pattern. Every time we develop a new way to look, we find more than we expected, and the discoveries consistently push civilization backward in time, make it bigger, make it more sophisticated than the textbooks claim. But LiDAR only works on land. What about underwater? 70% of Earth's surface is ocean, and we've mapped less than 20% of the seafloor in any detail. We have better maps of Mars than we do of our own ocean floor. And remember, at the end of the last ice age, 27 million square kilometers of coastal land went underwater. If you wanted to hide an entire civilization, the ocean floor is the perfect place. In 2023, researchers announced analysis of ice cores from Greenland that confirmed the presence of platinum anomalies at the Younger Dryas boundary layer. This wasn't a single study. Multiple independent teams from different institutions examined different cores from different locations. They all found the same thing. Something extraterrestrial hit Earth 12,800 years ago. The implications are profound. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, which was controversial and widely dismissed just 15 years ago, now has overwhelming physical evidence supporting it. And if that impact happened, if fragments of a comet struck the ice sheets and triggered global catastrophe, then every flood myth suddenly has a historical basis. The stories aren't allegory. They're survivor accounts passed down through generations. In 2022, geneticists published studies on ancient DNA extracted from human remains between 10,000 and 15,000 years old. What they found challenges previous models of human migration and population distribution. There are genetic signatures that don't fit neatly into the established framework. Populations that appear suddenly in the genetic record, then disappear or get absorbed. The paper carefully avoids speculation, but the data suggests significant population movements and mixing during the period right around the Younger Dryas. People were on the move, fleeing something, migrating in large numbers, mixing with populations they hadn't previously contacted. Exactly what you'd expect if coastal civilizations were being destroyed and survivors were pushing inland. Meanwhile, excavation at Göbekli Tepe continues. Though it's painfully slow, Klaus Schmidt believed they'd barely scratched the surface. Literally. Ground-penetrating radar suggests there are at least 20 more circles buried deeper than what's been uncovered. But funding is limited. Political instability in the region makes work dangerous, and the Turkish government controls access tightly. Schmidt's successors estimate it could take another 100 years to fully excavate the site at the current pace. Why so slow? Because every season of digging at Göbekli Tepe raises more questions than it answers, and those questions are uncomfortable for the established timeline. If people 11,600 years ago could build something that's sophisticated, what else were they capable of? What else might be buried that we haven't found yet? In 2024, oceanographic surveys using autonomous underwater vehicles discovered additional anomalous structures in the Persian Gulf. The data hasn't been fully published yet, but preliminary reports describe geometric formations on the seafloor consistent with human construction. The depth and location would place them on dry land during the period before post-glacial sea level rise. If these prove to be artificial structures, they would be direct evidence of the civilization that existed in the Persian Gulf Valley before it flooded. But access to the sites is restricted. The waters are politically sensitive. Multiple nations claim overlapping territorial rights. Oil companies control much of the exploration in the region, and their data is proprietary. So we have tantalizing hints, but no way to verify without permissions that aren't being granted. The scientific establishment moves slowly by design. That's good when it prevents bad research from being accepted prematurely. But it's frustrating when legitimate discoveries get bottlenecked by institutional gatekeeping. There's a difference between healthy skepticism and reflexive rejection of anything that challenges the accepted narrative. Here's what we know for certain as of right now. In 2025, impact evidence at the Younger Dryas boundary is confirmed. Massive flooding at the end of the Ice Age is confirmed. Sophisticated construction much earlier than previously thought is confirmed. Large-scale civilizations hidden beneath jungle canopy are confirmed. Genetic bottlenecks in the human population are confirmed. Underwater structures, in locations that were dry land before sea level rise, are strongly indicated, but awaiting further investigation. Each of these facts independently is interesting. Together, they form a picture that's hard to ignore. Something happened to human civilization approximately 12,000 years ago. Something catastrophic. Something that required survivors to rebuild from fragments. And the Adam and Eve story, along with its hundreds of cultural parallels, might be the oldest historical document we have, preserved not in writing but in collective memory, describing the moment when the world changed and humanity had to begin again. The evidence is there. We're finally developing the tools to see it clearly. There's an elephant in the room we need to address. If you've been following along, you might be wondering how any of this fits with the biblical timeline. Genesis genealogies, if you add them up literally, place Adam around 6,000 years ago. But we've been talking about events 12,000 years ago, about human populations existing for hundreds of thousands of years. So either the science is wrong, the Bible is wrong, or we're misunderstanding something fundamental about how to read these texts. Let me be clear. I'm not here to tell you what to believe religiously, but I do think there are ways to reconcile the archaeological evidence with the biblical account that don't require throwing out either one. First possibility. The genealogies have gaps. This isn't controversial among scholars. Ancient Near Eastern genealogies routinely skipped generations. When Matthew's Gospel traces Jesus' lineage back to Abraham, it says, Abraham begat Isaac, Isaac begat Jacob, and so on. But begat doesn't necessarily mean immediate father. It can mean ancestor. The Hebrew word often translated as son can equally mean descendant, grandson, great-grandson, someone 10 generations removed. If you look at Genesis chapter 5, the pre-flood genealogy from Adam to Noah, it's suspiciously neat. Exactly 10 generations. Ancient texts loved round numbers. They loved symbolic structures. It's entirely possible this genealogy is highlighting significant figures while omitting countless others. If each begat actually represents hundreds or thousands of years of lineage, suddenly the timeline expands dramatically. Second possibility. Adam wasn't the first human, but the first human of a new covenant or dispensation. This is called the pre-Adamite hypothesis, and it's been discussed by theologians for centuries. The idea is that Genesis chapter 1 describes the creation of humans in general. Male and female, he created them, blessing them to fill the earth. Then Genesis chapter 2 zooms in on a specific couple, Adam and Eve, who receive special attention and instruction. This would explain where Cain's wife came from, why he feared other people would kill him, and how he built a city. There were already humans out there. Adam and Eve were significant not because they were the first biological humans, but because they were the first to receive divine revelation, the first to have a conscious relationship with God, the first representatives of humanity in a new phase of development. Third possibility. The days of creation aren't literal 24-hour periods. 2 Peter chapter 3 verse 8 says, "With the Lord a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like a day." If each creation day represents a geological epoch, then Genesis is describing billions of years of natural history in poetic form. Humans appear on day 6, which could represent the entire span of human evolution and development. Fourth, And this is where it gets interesting for our purposes. What if Genesis is describing a reset, not the original creation? What if there was a previous world, a pre-flood civilization, and Genesis is documenting the re-establishment of order after that world was destroyed? The Hebrew word translated as created in Genesis chapter 1 verse 1 is bara, which means to create from nothing, but in verse 2, the word changes. The earth was formless and empty. Could also be translated, the earth became formless and empty. Some scholars argue there's a gap between verses 1 and 2, a period of unknown length during which something happened to make the created earth become chaotic and void. Then the rest of Genesis chapter 1 describes God restructuring, reforming, bringing order back to a world that had fallen into chaos. If this gap theory is correct, then Adam isn't the first human ever. He's the first human of the current era, the post-catastrophe world. Everything before the gap, including the advanced pre-flood civilization we've been discussing, happened in that previous age and isn't detailed in Genesis because it's not relevant to the covenant story being told. Look, I'm not claiming any of these interpretations is definitively correct, but they demonstrate that you don't have to choose between science and scripture. The biblical text is complex, written in ancient languages with cultural assumptions very different from ours, translated and retranslated over millennia. There's room for multiple valid readings. What matters for our investigation is this: whether Adam lived 6,000 or 60,000 or 600,000 years ago, whether he was the first human or the first human of a new era, the core story remains consistent. There was a catastrophe. There were survivors. Knowledge was lost and had to be preserved. Civilization had to restart, and the memory of those events became the foundation story of multiple cultures around the world. The timeline debate is important for theologians and scientists to sort out. But for understanding human history and the possibility of lost civilizations, what matters is recognizing that something profound happened in our past, something that shaped every culture's origin story, something that might explain the sudden appearance of sophisticated technology and knowledge in the archaeological record. Adam and Eve, whether literal individuals or symbolic representatives, stand at the boundary between the world that was lost and the world we inherited. Ancient texts weren't written the way we write today. We expect literal journalism, objective reporting, clear distinctions between fact and metaphor. But cultures thousands of years ago encoded truth in symbol and story. They layered meanings, embedding practical information within narrative frameworks that could survive oral transmission across generations. So when we read about a serpent talking to Eve, we need to ask, what is this story actually trying to tell us? The serpent in Genesis isn't described as evil initially. It's described as crafty, shrewd, more subtle than any beast of the field. The Hebrew word is nachash, which yes means serpent, but its root meaning relates to shining, gleaming, or to practice divination. Ancient serpent symbolism across cultures represents wisdom, knowledge, transformation, and immortality. The snake sheds its skin and appears reborn. It moves between earth and the underworld in mythology. It's associated with healing in the medical caduceus. In Kundalini traditions, it represents awakening consciousness. So when the serpent offers Eve knowledge, we might be looking at a metaphor for encountering a source of advanced information, not a literal reptile, but a teacher, a technology, an outside influence that provided access to understanding that fundamentally changed human consciousness. The serpent doesn't force Eve. It presents a choice. It challenges God's prohibition by asking, did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden? It's the voice of questioning, of skepticism, of curiosity overcoming obedience. And what happens when Eve eats? The text says her eyes were opened. She saw that she was naked and felt shame. This isn't botanical magic. These are psychological effects. She gained self-awareness, abstract thinking, the ability to conceptualize past and future, to feel embarrassment and anticipate consequences. She became, in a very real sense, consciously human in a way she wasn't before. Neuroscience tells us that human consciousness, our ability for complex abstract thought, is relatively recent in evolutionary terms. Something happened in our cognitive development, some change that made us different from our hominid ancestors. We started creating art, developing language, planning for the future, contemplating mortality. The fruit of knowledge might be a mythological way of describing that cognitive leap, that moment when humans crossed the threshold into full self-awareness. But there's a darker reading available too. What if the knowledge wasn't just consciousness, but specific technologies? The tree of knowledge of good and evil, after all, grants understanding of both beneficial and harmful applications. Every technology is dual use. Fire cooks food and provides warmth, but it also burns cities. Metallurgy creates tools for farming and weapons for war. Nuclear physics gives us power plants and bombs. Genetic engineering promises cures for disease and opens the door to biological weapons. When Prometheus gave fire to humans, the gods punished him eternally because he'd given mortals something they weren't ready to handle responsibly. When the Watchers taught metallurgy and warfare, it led to violence and corruption. When Oannes taught civilization, it came with the burden of maintaining complex societies that eventually collapsed. Knowledge, once given, can't be taken back, and advanced knowledge in the hands of people without the wisdom to use it properly becomes catastrophically dangerous. God's statement after they ate, "The man has now become like one of us," knowing good and evil, isn't just about moral awareness, it's about capability. They now possess knowledge that makes them powerful, perhaps dangerously so, and the solution is expulsion from Eden, cutting them off from the tree of life, ensuring they remain mortal and don't combine immortality with this new, dangerous knowledge. Let's talk about that other tree, the tree of life. It's mentioned at the beginning and the end of the Eden story, but never explained. Eating from it grants eternal life. After Adam and Eve eat from the tree of knowledge, God stations cherubim with a flaming sword to guard the path to the tree of life, preventing their return. What if the tree of life represents the conditions that allowed for extended lifespan? The perfect environment, the optimal atmosphere, the genetic advantages we discussed earlier. Eden as a protected biosphere, a place where humans could live for centuries because everything was calibrated perfectly for longevity. When they were expelled, they weren't just leaving a garden. They were leaving the only place on Earth where those conditions still existed. The cherubim with the flaming sword aren't supernatural guardians. They're a metaphor for the impossibility of return. You can't go back to a place that's now underwater, flooded by rising seas. The sword of flame is the catastrophe itself, the comet impacts, and the deluge that destroyed the old world. Nakedness is another symbol worth examining. Before eating the fruit, Adam and Eve were naked and felt no shame. After eating, they suddenly realized their nakedness and tried to cover themselves. On a surface level, this is about the origin of modesty and clothing, but symbolically, nakedness represents vulnerability, lack of protection. In the context of an advanced civilization, clothing might represent technology, infrastructure, the systems that protect humans from nature's harshness. Before the fall, they had everything they needed. They were protected, provided for, living in a technological society that met all their needs. After the fall, they're exposed, vulnerable, forced to make crude coverings from leaves because their sophisticated garments, their advanced protective technologies, are gone. They're reduced to survival mode, using whatever materials nature provides to protect themselves from elements they no longer have the technology to control. Cain's mark is another enigma. After killing Abel, Cain fears that anyone who finds him will kill him. God places a mark on Cain, ensuring that no one who meets him will harm him. What kind of mark provides protection? A visible sign of divine protection that others recognize and respect? Or perhaps a genetic marker, a biological characteristic that identifies him as part of a particular lineage? In a world where different populations with different levels of technological development coexisted, such markers might have been crucial for identification and survival. The cherubim themselves deserve attention. They're not cute baby angels in Renaissance paintings. Biblical cherubim are described as powerful, fearsome beings with multiple faces and wings. In ancient Near Eastern art, cherubim were guardian statues, often depicted with human faces, eagle wings, and lion or bull bodies. They represented the pinnacle of creation, combining the intelligence of humans, the vision of eagles, the strength of bulls, and the courage of lions. What if cherubim weren't supernatural beings but an ancient memory of something real? Advanced vehicles with lights and power, defensive installations around the lost city or region, preventing re-entry. The flaming sword turning every direction could describe rotating mechanisms, energy fields, natural barriers created by volcanic activity or other geological upheaval. Ancient people, lacking vocabulary for advanced technology, would describe what they saw in terms they understood. Divine guardians, burning swords, supernatural protection, every element of the Eden story, when examined as encoded information rather than literal history or pure allegory, reveals layers of possible meaning. It's a text that has survived because it carried important information in a form that could be remembered and transmitted before writing existed. The symbols protected the message, allowed it to pass through countless retellings without being lost entirely. And at the center of these symbols are Adam and Eve, not just as individuals but as representations of humanity itself, at a crossroads. The choice between ignorance and knowledge, between safety and danger, between remaining in paradise and venturing into a harsher world with greater capability but also greater responsibility. They chose knowledge. They chose consciousness. They chose to leave the garden, or were forced out when it was destroyed. And we've been living with the consequences ever since. We're standing at a peculiar moment in history. For the first time since the flood, humanity possesses technology that could genuinely threaten our own existence. Nuclear weapons capable of rendering the planet uninhabitable. Artificial intelligence advancing faster than our ability to control it. Genetic engineering that could rewrite what it means to be human. Climate systems destabilizing in ways that remind geologists of the rapid shifts at the end of the Younger Dryas. Makes you wonder if we've been here before. Robert Oppenheimer, after witnessing the first atomic bomb test in 1945, quoted the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." But later, when asked if this was the first atomic bomb, he gave a strange answer. He said, "Well, yes, in modern times." In modern times? What did he mean by that? Had Oppenheimer, who was deeply read in ancient Sanskrit texts, encountered descriptions of weapons that sounded disturbingly similar to nuclear devices? The Mahabharata describes the Brahmastra, a weapon that produced an incandescent column of smoke and flame, bright as 10,000 suns. It caused hair and nails to fall out, contaminated food, and made warriors throw themselves into rivers to wash off the poison. That's not how you describe conventional weapons. That's how you describe radiation sickness. The text says, "A single projectile charged with all the power of the universe, an incandescent column of smoke and flame, as bright as 10,000 suns rose in all its splendor. It was an unknown weapon, an iron thunderbolt, a gigantic messenger of death which reduced to ashes the entire race. The corpses were so burned as to be unrecognizable. Hair and nails fell out. Pottery broke without apparent cause, and the birds turned white. After a few hours, all foodstuffs were infected." You can dismiss this as poetic exaggeration, or you can ask yourself what ancient people were describing, if not something that actually happened. What if the forbidden knowledge that destroyed the pre-flood civilization was exactly what we're playing with now? Advanced energy systems, weapons of mass destruction, technologies that gave immense power without the wisdom to wield it safely. The Watchers taught humans metallurgy and warfare. What happens when you give weapons technology to societies that aren't psychologically or ethically prepared for it? They use them, they escalate, they destroy, and then the survivors have to start over, telling their children, please remember what happened. Don't make the same mistakes. We had everything and we lost it because we couldn't control our own creations. But we forget. Humanity's memory is short. In just 75 years since Hiroshima and Nagasaki, nuclear weapons have gone from unthinkable horror to geopolitical chess pieces. We've normalized the existence of devices that could end civilization. We're developing autonomous weapons systems that can kill without human oversight. We're editing human embryos without fully understanding the consequences. We're eating from the tree of knowledge again, and we're not asking whether we should. The archaeological evidence suggests advanced civilizations have risen and fallen before. The geological evidence confirms catastrophic events that reset progress. The mythological evidence preserves memories of worlds that ended. If that pattern is real, if we're not the first technological civilization on this planet, then we need to understand why the previous ones failed. Because we're on the same trajectory. Climate researchers talk about tipping points, moments when systems cross thresholds and change becomes irreversible. The Younger Dryas wasn't gradual, it was sudden. Whatever triggered it, whether comet impact or other factors, the climate flipped in years, not centuries. Our current climate system is showing signs of instability. Ice sheets melting faster than models predicted, ocean currents shifting, weather patterns becoming chaotic. We like to think we're in control, that our technology makes us invulnerable. But the pre-flood civilization probably thought the same thing, right up until the moment the sky started falling. Here's what keeps me awake at night. The evidence of previous advanced civilizations is mostly underwater, buried, or dismissed by institutions that can't accept challenges to established timelines. We're not learning from that history because we refuse to acknowledge it existed. We're repeating the experiment without reading the results from the last time it was run. The story of Adam and Eve isn't ancient mythology with no relevance to modern life. It's a warning label written in the only language that could survive 12,000 years. Human memory encoded in story. Don't eat the forbidden fruit. Don't take knowledge before you're ready. Don't build what you can't control. Because the fall from paradise isn't metaphorical. It's what happens when civilization gets too clever for its own good. And if we're the descendants of survivors who watched their whole world drown, who lost everything except fragments of memory and scraps of technology, then we carry that trauma in our collective DNA. We're still trying to rebuild what was lost, still reaching for the tree of life, the extended lifespans, the perfect conditions, the advanced capabilities our ancestors supposedly possessed. But maybe the lesson isn't about regaining paradise. Maybe it's about learning to live wisely in the world we have, with the knowledge we've been given, without destroying ourselves in the process. Maybe that's what the story was always trying to teach us. The question is, are we listening? We started this journey in the desert hills of Turkey, standing beside Klaus Schmidt at Göbekli Tepe, staring at stones that shouldn't exist. We followed the evidence across continents and through millennia, from the flooded valleys of the Persian Gulf to the DNA coiled in every cell of your body. And now, after 2 hours of diving deep into mysteries that most people never even know to question, we need to ask, what does it all mean? Let me lay out what we've discovered. The Persian Gulf was a fertile river valley 12,000 years ago, matching the biblical description of Eden with remarkable precision. Genetic evidence confirms humanity went through severe population bottlenecks, with one occurring exactly when global catastrophe struck at the end of the Younger Dryas. Archaeological sites like Göbekli Tepe appear suddenly with no developmental progression, suggesting knowledge that already existed rather than technology being invented from scratch. Monumental construction appears worldwide, using similar techniques despite cultures being separated by oceans and millennia. Precision manufacturing in ancient Egypt and elsewhere exceeds what should be possible with Bronze Age tools. Underwater structures sit in locations that were dry land only before post-glacial flooding. Ancient maps show coastlines that haven't been visible for 10,000 years. Over 500 cultures independently tell stories of a first human couple, a paradise lost, and a catastrophic flood. That's not coincidence. That's not mythology. That's evidence. And at the center of all these threads, connecting ancient texts to modern genetics, archaeological anomalies to geological catastrophes, stands the story of Adam and Eve, not as Sunday school cartoon characters, but as potentially real people, survivors of a civilization that drowned when the ice melted and the seas rose, representatives of humanity at the moment when everything changed, when the old world ended and we had to begin again with whatever fragments of knowledge could be preserved. If this hypothesis is correct, and I want to be clear that it's still a hypothesis, though one with substantial supporting evidence, then we are the children of survivors. Our DNA carries echoes of populations that experienced unimaginable catastrophe. Our myths preserve memories that predate writing by thousands of years. Our most ancient structures might be attempts to rebuild what was lost, created by people who still remembered how things were done before the flood. The Garden of Eden isn't waiting for us in heaven. It's waiting 300 feet beneath the Persian Gulf, buried under sediment and seawater, along with whatever cities and monuments and records that civilization created. The Tree of Knowledge isn't in some mystical dimension. It's the sum total of technologies and understandings that were passed from the pre-flood world to the survivors who had to start over. And the warning encoded in the story, the prohibition against eating the fruit, the consequences of the fall, that's not about divine punishment for disobedience. It's about the terrible responsibility that comes with advanced knowledge. The pre-flood civilization, whatever it was, didn't fall because God was angry. It fell because humanity gained capabilities we weren't wise enough to handle. We built what we couldn't control. We changed the environment in ways we didn't understand. We created weapons we couldn't resist using. And then the comet came, or the climate shifted, or whatever combination of factors triggered the Younger Dryas catastrophe, and everything we'd built washed away. The survivors remembered. They told their children, and their children's children, and the story spread and evolved, and took on symbolic weight until it became the foundation myth of civilization itself. Be careful with knowledge. Respect the power you're given. Remember that paradise can be lost if you're not vigilant. We forgot that lesson. We're doing it again, playing with technologies that could end us, changing the climate without understanding the consequences, building artificial intelligence without knowing if we can control it, editing genes without grasping the full implications. We're right back at the Tree of Knowledge, reaching for fruit we might not be ready to digest. But here's the thing about knowing history. It gives you the chance to make different choices. If we understand that advanced civilizations have fallen before, that catastrophe has reset human progress multiple times, then maybe we can avoid being the next civilization that has to restart from zero. Maybe we can be the generation that finally learns the lesson encoded in our oldest stories. The greatest discovery isn't buried in the ground waiting for archaeologists to find. It's not hidden in ancient texts waiting for translators to decode. The greatest discovery is recognizing that we've been here before, that the story we thought was mythology is actually memory, and that the warning that's been passed down for 12,000 years is more relevant right now than it's ever been. Adam and Eve weren't the first humans. They were the first humans who remembered, the first ones to carry knowledge from the world that was lost into the world that had to be rebuilt. They're our ancestors in the deepest possible sense, not just genetically but culturally, the ones who gave us the gift of memory and the burden of trying to preserve what matters when everything else is washing away. We stand where they stood, at the edge of paradise, looking back at what we might lose and forward at what we might become. The choice is the same one they faced. Do we reach for more knowledge, more power, more capability, without the wisdom to use it safely? Or do we finally learn from the past, respect the forces we're unleashing, and build something that can actually last? The garden is still out there, beneath the waves, waiting to be rediscovered. Not so we can return to it, because you can never go back, but so we can remember what happens when civilization gets too clever for its own survival. The story isn't over. We're living in its next chapter right now. And whether this chapter ends in catastrophe or wisdom, whether we become another lost civilization or the first one to break the cycle, that's being written by the choices we make today. The question that started this investigation was, what if Adam and Eve were real figures from an advanced pre-flood civilization? After everything we've examined, I think the better question is, what are we going to do with that knowledge? Because the fruit has been eaten, the knowledge is ours. And just like our ancestors 12,000 years ago, we have to decide what kind of world we're going to build with it. The garden awaits, not ahead of us, but beneath us, a reminder of what we've lost and what we could lose again. And somewhere in our DNA, in our myths, in our collective memory, Adam and Eve are still there, still warning us, still hoping that maybe this time their children will be wise enough to listen. Thanks for taking this journey with me. If you found this investigation valuable, if it made you question what you thought you knew about human history, then please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you want to keep exploring these hidden chapters of our past. And hit that notification bell because there are more mysteries waiting, more questions that deserve asking, more stories that need telling. Until next time, keep questioning, keep searching, and remember, the greatest truths are often the ones we've been told are impossible. One last thing before you go. In 2023, a classified deep-sea survey detected something in the Persian Gulf that made 3 governments immediately restrict access to those coordinates. The footage has never been released. But maybe it's time we started asking why.